our song leader Loa and our piano player Zoe. We appreciate your input every day. Our greeters this morning, hold your hands up. I can't remember. There were 2 or 3 different ones. Joe, Ken. Okay. Even I greeted a little bit. Okay. And thanks to Loa and Nick. We have cookies again this morning. You know who did the coffee. Yeah, she did. What?
You did the coffee.
Barbara, we got any visitors this morning?
We do. We have Catherine, and she's sitting with the Joneses. And I don't have my cheat sheet here. I only have 2 hands. Can't turn the page to forward. Anyway, Catherine, welcome to Contemporary Forum. Catherine, go on.
Is that it? All right. We got any joys and concerns this morning? June?
I'm going to ask you to pray for me on Thursday morning. I'm having cancer surgery, so give me a prayer or 2, thanks.
Okay. Ken?
Mary Breckenridge had surgery Thursday, and I visited her Friday morning, and she was looking really well. And we had a nice visit, and she was cheerful, and so I think she is on her road to recovery. Today she should be over at the Wesleyan on Scenic Drive. Her son Mark told me that yesterday, Saturday, that she was going to be transferred over there. So I know she would just love for you to come and visit her and spend some time with her. Now, before I give this microphone back to the bishop, I want to take it over here to Jim Montgomery. Jim Montgomery has just been honored, and I'm sure all of us are going to be so proud of him, but I want him to tell you about it.
Actually, Alan Rogers should tell you more than I can, because he was on it 4 years ago, and this is the honor flight. And it's a week from Friday, we'll leave at Austin and fly to Washington, D.C. Then all day Saturday, we'll visit all the statues and we'll also end up with the changing the guard at Arlington, and which I understand is very impressive. Like I say, Alan can probably tell you more than I, but one of the things they're running out of us World War II vets, and so they got in real quick, but they're starting to take the this will be the 50th flight, and there will be 50 of us on it. And so it's quite a big thing, but looking forward to it.
Good. Bob Keels made that flight too.
What's that? Bob Keels did too.
Yes, I remember when Bob did and Alan did, and so now Jim is. Jim was in the Navy, so anchors away.
Okay. Somebody asked me for an update on what's going on with me. So I'll tell you just briefly. I was supposed to have a heart cath about 2 weeks ago, and I developed a cough, and the doc said it probably wouldn't be a good idea to have a piece of steel up in your heart and then you start coughing. So they put it off. I'll be going to get it done this week though. As to my wife, she's having a pretty hard time. I think she's got AFib and has a tough time. Well, Monty, you know. And I think consider doing a pacemaker for her, and I think that'll make a difference.
What about her knees?
Well, we're getting it where she can walk a little bit before she gets the knee working on it. But that's in the future, I'm sure. Okay. Carter.
Some of you have asked where Norton is today. He fell, and he has one broken rib and 2 cracked ribs, so he's not breathing too well today. And it all was because of leaves in the yard, you know? We're gonna have to hire a gardener. He's not very good at it.
Should we ask how he got a broken rib?
He fell on concrete.
Well, that'll do it.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, we have 3 birthdays. Oh,
I'd like to ask for prayers for my brother. He's going through an AFib problem as well. And he's quite a bit older than I, lives in Dallas. And so just keep him in your prayers. And then I have a dear friend who is suffering from some severe depression in Dallas as well. And her name is Mary. Think about her. Thank you.
It's your brother, you didn't tell us. Bob.
okay. All right, we have 3 birthdays today. The first one is Laura, my wife. Today's her birthday.
Oh,
I'll tell you, she's 81.
And she's not here. Yeah, right.
You got that right. No, it doesn't bother. You know, you get in your 80s and it doesn't really bother anymore.
What? It does.
Well, some people it doesn't. All right. Sandy Tennell is on the 27th, and she's not here this morning. And then Julia Papa George, she is here. And don't you ask her about her.
And I don't mind telling, I don't mind telling, okay? I remember when I was gonna do the double nickel, y'all remember when we did the double nickel? Because I decided to do the double nickel, 55. So I am going to be behind that 8th ball, double 8. And I'm so thankful.
May I have a birthday?
Well, sure.
This is not mine, but it's Joe's mom's. Was y'all have heard about her so much, but I must share this. Mom was 101 Friday. So we picked up a birthday cake at H-E-B Bakery. We started through the line and the cashier said, "Oh, what a beautiful cake." And I said, "Well, it's for a 101-year-old, my mother-in-law." And so she turned to Joe and she said, "Your mother?" And Joe said, "Yes." She said, "How old are you?"
Just like I look, 43.
We weren't able to get her out of her big red recliner, which seems to recline backward more and more. But we brought the birthday cake to her, to the chair, and we all gathered around. And even though she didn't like the birthday cake, I could tell. Because more than half of it was still there, you know. But it was a lot of sugar, that's just as well. But anyway, just wanted you to know that that goal, I guess that she must have had, she reached.
All right. Well, you may have noticed that there are more and more people that are reaching the century mark. Okay. Alan? Sorry. Joe?
Refreshment list, I've changed my pitch from threat to love. Sign it.
That was very low.
Promised us heaven last time.
You never know where he's coming from.
Eleanor has
Eleanor?
I forgot to mention that Sam Bowman had some nasal surgery,
and he has had trouble with bleeding this last week, and they've ended up putting a clip on his nose, hoping that that will stop it, and he goes in tomorrow, and hopefully things will be better, but it's not been very pleasant.
Anything else? All right. The original prayer person is not here this morning, so I've prevailed upon the bishop to stand in.
For what?
And then the lesson is Kevin.
I'm doing prayer.
Huh?
I'm doing the prayer.
You are?
All
That's right. Those of us of the cloth will fight to pray. Isn't that right, Bishop? Ready in and out of season. I want to say, first of all, it absolutely blows my mind, every one of you who are 80 years old and older. I guess when I was younger, somehow or another, I lost two grandparents at 84, one at 79 and one in their 60s. And I always thought 84 would be, you know, kind of like the perfect age. Well, all those of you who are around 84 or past it, I'm sure don't agree. And I have to say myself, I'm in a state of shock that I'm going to turn into another decade myself this year in May. But you all absolutely amaze me and astound me. Those of you who are older, I mean, I think you're phenomenal. I can't imagine living that old. I still see 84 out there, but keep in mind, I'm tempered by 2 generations of dementia. So, on my maternal side, that makes a difference. All right. Dear Lord and Wesley, forgive me, but we're going to move from being on the lighthearted side to the more serious side. It had come up last week around Ken's lesson about the covenant prayer from the Wesleyan tradition. And John Wesley, I think it was around 1781, something like that, began a covenant service. And normally this was done at actually New Year's Eve. In my church, as I know, in Oklahoma, we used to do it on the first Sunday in January. And it's a very serious service because it is about our basic fundamental covenant relationship with God, in which not only do we accept the love that God has for us and the ongoing grace and support, but we commit and surrender ourselves to God. And so there was a request for that prayer, and I just have the prayer here that's out of the hymnal on page 607. But if any time you wanted, Ken, to do that service, and people really wanted to do it, I'd be happy to lead the class in it. And would pass out information beforehand so you could know yourself if you really wanted to say the words. You know, sometimes at baptismal services, when the minister goes through the various questions and things, we can lightly answer, oh yes, I reject the powers of Satan and so forth. But do we really think sometimes about what we're saying? And this would be an invitation to really think about it and embrace the covenant through Christ that we're offered. So if you'll join your hearts with mine, please, the covenant prayer in the Wesleyan tradition. I am no longer my own, but thine. Put me to what thou wilt. Rank me with whom thou wilt. Put me to doing, put me to suffering. Let me be employed by thee or laid aside by thee. Exalted for thee or brought low by thee. Let me be full, let me be empty. Let me have all things, let me have nothing. I freely and heartily yield all things to thy pleasure and disposal. And now, O gracious and blessed Lord, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, thou art mine and I am thine. So be it. And the covenant which I have made on earth, let it be ratified in heaven. Amen and amen.
It really is so nice to have Ann here with us and occasionally participating. It means a lot to me, and I'm sure it does to everyone. If I must say, it's just amazing to me to think that Audrey Wilson is 101 years old. I would like to explain to you that I knew Joe's mother in Orange pretty well. And she was the director of the Red Cross in Orange for many, many years, and really was one of the more well-known persons in our city. And she was always such a lovely person and active that it's just hard for me to believe that your dear mom is 101. I wish that you would tell her that I have thought of her, and I do so, in fact, from time to time. By the way, wasn't that a wonderful worship service this morning? And for those of you who are about to go upstairs, well, I think you're really in for a blessing today. Well, before I begin today's lesson, I want to just comment that I have leaned very heavily on the writings of Adam Hamilton and William Barclay in the first two lessons of this Lenten series. But today I will also be relying on them, but I will be using the works of another writer. And I want to say just a word about him because I think he's a very interesting fellow. I'm talking about Joe Strobel. Strobel is the writer of several books, The Case for Christ, The Case for Christianity. He's written several, in fact, but he's an interesting fellow. As a young man, he went off to the Yale Law School, got his degree in law. I understand that's the finest law school in America. Then he went to Chicago and won several prizes as the legal writer for the legal editor, really, of the Chicago Tribune. So he was a very outstanding fellow, but he was an atheist, absolute atheist, and was for some years, many years. But the strangest thing happened in that his wife decided that she wanted to go to church, and so she started going to church, and she became a Christian, and he noted that her behavior changed, and he admired her and approved of her life. So he decided that, well, maybe he should investigate Christianity and the claims of Christ, and that's exactly what he did. He used his legal mind and looked into it and studied, and the bottom line is he became an apologist for the Christian faith. What that means is a defender of the faith. And so what interested me is that several very outstanding theologians have endorsed him. And one is Bruce Metzger of Princeton University. I have the highest regard for Bruce Metzger, and so if he endorsed Lee Strobel, then I decided that I should look into him. So I've been reading his books, and so today I will use some quotations of his, and I wanted you to know a little bit about Strobel. And so last week we had Jesus in the garden with Judas. Following that, there was a trial. According to our standards, it wasn't much of a trial. It kind of reminds me of a trial that they used to have in the western days of this country. Not much of a trial. And before you know it, a fellow was being strung up under the oak tree. The truth of the matter is as our pastor said a while ago, the Romans didn't know what to do. Pilate didn't know what to do. There was really no cause for the crucifixion of Jesus. It's just that the high priest, the Pharisees, of the Jewish faith. They were insistent, and it was important for the Romans to get along with the Jews, and so therefore they crucified Jesus. And that's where I want to start today. And in fact, I will begin with Lee Strobel in his book, The Case for Christianity. He states simply that the execution of Jesus is an indisputable fact. And that is absolutely true. All four Gospels attest to it. And there are numerous non-Christian accounts of the crucifixion of Jesus. I think all faiths pretty well agree to that. And so that Jesus was crucified, well, there's no question about that. There are only two things that I want to comment about, and then I'd like to leave Golgotha. By the way, Golgotha was where Jesus was crucified. We're talking about geography here. Just outside of town, well, actually a pretty good little distance south of town, was a hill that to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, it looked like a skull. It seemed to be a skull carved out of rock. And so therefore they just called it the skull. And one of our versions of the Bible, I even believe maybe it's the Common Bible, I'm not sure about that. Instead of calling it Golgotha, they just called it the skull. But so there is, of course, where they crucified Jesus. The only apostle to be at the foot of Jesus, and there were many people walking back and forth, some taunting him and so on. But the only apostle there was John. John was there. Mary Magdalene was there. Mary, the mother of Jesus, there. Another one or two women were there. All the other disciples had fled in terror that this might happen to them. And so they wanted no part of that. And so Jesus looked down to Mary, his mother, and say, "Woman, here is your son." He didn't motion because obviously he couldn't. And then he says to John, "Here is your mother." And I think that this is an important happening because it shows the compassion of Jesus in his worst moment, in his most agonizing moment. He showed his love for his mother and made that arrangement. Now, in fact, that is what happened. John, I'm sure, took Mary back to his home in Galilee where they lived. All the other disciples after Pentecost went out into the world preaching all over the world, as far as India, in fact. And they all ended their lives in a terrible, terrible way. They were all killed and killed in a very awful way. The only exception was John. And John was spared that because he stayed in Galilee and took care of Mary, the mother of Jesus. I just think that is a wonderful happening on the cross, and I wanted to share it with you. The other thing that I wanted to share with you is that there were two others crucified at the same time of Jesus, two thieves. And to our knowledge, we just at this time only had 3 crosses there. And at least they're the only ones spoken of. Well, one of the thieves started saying some pretty bad things about Jesus, to Jesus, taunting him, saying, "You are supposed to be the King of the Jews, the Christ. Well, for heaven's sakes," he said, "why don't you save yourself, and, well, while you're at it, why don't you save us?" And that was his attitude. And well, the other thief said, "You just need to be quiet. We're here because we deserve to be here. we're guilty of a crime, so we're here. But this man did nothing. This man did nothing. Don't you have some concern for what God is thinking about us, especially since we are about to die? And so he said to Jesus, he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus said to him, I assure you that today you will be with me in paradise. The important thing there are several lessons, but the one I want to stress is that you need to know that this is one of the basis for the belief that when we die, that when death comes, that we enter paradise with Jesus at once. Not some date in the future, but at once. This is one of the reasons for that belief. Now, as William Barclay says, the story of the crucifixion of Jesus really requires no commentary, and so I will really say nothing else about it except to comment that Jesus died at 3 p.m., about 3 p.m. on Friday, on Good Friday. Now, Joseph of Arimathea was a wealthy Jew. He was a member of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was a council of your leading Jewish leaders, thinkers, and he would have been close to the high priest and so on. His friend Nicodemus was like that. He also was a member of the Sanhedrin, and the two of them opposed the crucifixion of Jesus, but of course were badly outvoted. But Joseph of Arimathea went to Pilate and asked permission to be able to bury Jesus, and Pilate gave him that permission. So after the Roman soldiers took Jesus off the cross, Joseph and Nicodemus took Jesus over to one of took him over to his own burial site. Joseph had recently purchased this burial site, which was in a garden not far from the cross. They didn't have to carry Jesus far. They took him over and prepared his body, and Nicodemus brought many different oils and so on, and so they buried Jesus in Joseph's own tomb, freshly hewn in rock, where they placed his body, and Joseph then had a large stone rolled in front of the entrance. So those two things I wanted to comment on, and then show you how the crucifixion really ended with the burial of Jesus. Often that is not noted. Now the question comes, on the second day, on Saturday, what did Jesus do? One version would be of the Apostles' Creed, which states that Jesus entered Sheol, which is a New Testament term for a place of the dead. That the Spirit of Jesus went down to Sheol, where he preached his gospel, his good news, to Old Testament people, to people who had lived before he lived. And they were not aware of Jesus and what he means to the kingdom of God. And so he preached. Now, that is, of course, in the Apostles' Creed. And in many churches, of course, the Apostles' Creed is repeated every Sunday. We do it occasionally. Recently, Ann and I, in fact, taught a book on the Apostles' Creed. And as I told you when it came my time, that at least in my opinion, it's not absolutely necessary that you believe every independent clause in the Apostles' Creed. This is the one, quite frankly, that I have trouble with. The scriptural support for the belief that Jesus went down to Sheol to witness to Old Testament people is very, very thin. I looked at this week. In fact, is very thin, so that, in my opinion, that inclusion in the Apostles' Creed by the early church fathers is really based on speculation more than anything else. And, you know, that's my opinion. You can certainly have your opinion. But I do agree with this statement that by Adam Hamilton, who concludes what Jesus... Dixie, I wonder if you'd bring me some coffee. My cup is right over here. I'm having some trouble with my voice this morning. Adam Hamilton concludes that what Jesus actually did in the spirit while his body laid in the tomb will remain a mystery. And that's where I stand. It's simply a mystery. But for his followers left behind on earth, the period between his death and resurrection was a dark time, the darkest time ever. Thank you so much, babes. And so, Holy Saturday simply represents despair and utter hopelessness. Now, of course, the third day would have been Sunday. As far as the Jews were concerned, that actually started very late on, not necessarily very late, but late on Saturday night. But it was not until morning that Mary Magdalene, with a couple of others, found that the large rock was rolled away from the tomb. I think it's interesting that Mary Magdalene was at the cross of Jesus when the disciples were not. And she was the first one who saw the empty tomb. I think that's interesting. You know, if you recall, when Jesus left Nazareth out of necessity, his old neighbors and so on didn't want him around. And he was walking toward Upper Galilee to Capernaum. Well, he stopped for the night where Mary Magdalene lived. And she was in a terrible state. You might say she had serious mental problems. And he healed her. And he healed her. And then after that, in my opinion, she probably came closer to Jesus than anyone else, just out of gratitude for what he did for her. But here, nevertheless, she and others found this empty tomb. And so they had come to bring oils and to anoint his body, but there it was. He wasn't there. So I think that is an important and interesting story. Now, among the disciples, there was considerable doubt. And it wasn't just doubting Thomas in the upper room. We remember that story. The disciples as a whole just had a hard time believing that Jesus bodily was resurrected. Most writers are extremely grateful that the gospel writers included this in the New Testament, that the apostles had their doubts, because, you know, naturally we, living this far away from the incident, of course, we would have our doubts. And so it helps to know that even the men and the best friends of Jesus at that time, that they had their doubts. But now the Jewish leaders, they didn't have doubts. As a matter of fact, when the guards came to them and said, hey, his body is gone, they believed it. They believed it. The guards had fallen asleep. And so the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees and so on, well, they told the guards, listen, go out and tell everybody that the followers of Jesus stole the body, that the followers of Jesus have that body. So go out and tell everyone, and they paid the soldiers to do it, and the soldiers did it. So that was the word that got out in Jerusalem. I thought that was rather interesting. At least you can say one thing for the high priest, they were pretty consistent. Now, let's see here, what am I going to be talking about next? It's a mystery, actually. Now, what actually happened next is that, of course, after the resurrection of Jesus, he appeared before them on multiple occasions over a period of 40 days. This, by the way, not only from gospel accounts, but from non-Christian accounts as well. It was, according to Lee Strobel, in a variety of circumstances, we actually have 9 ancient sources inside and outside the New Testament confirming the conviction of the apostles that they had encountered the risen Christ. So, that then took away the doubts of the apostles. Now, one of the arguments, and I realize this morning I'm coming at this to a certain extent as an apologist or a defender of faith. I think that really it's important to do so at this time. Thank you for this hot coffee, it's helping. One of the arguments against Christianity is that Christ and the resurrection and all these things happened so far ago, and that the first writings that we can go by happened so much later. Therefore, it kind of casts a certain doubt and a shadow over the credibility of the records. But according to L. Michael White of the University of Texas, that the 1 Corinthians, written by Paul, was written about 53 Common Era, CE, just 23 years after the cross. Just 23 years after the cross, Corinthians were written. And let's look here at an important section. I did a wonderful job in transcribing my notes. It says, oh, here it is, chapter 15, 17. If Christ has not been raised, then your faith is worthless. Yeah. Without the resurrection, Christianity is not worth much. But in fact, Christ has indeed been raised from the dead. Written 23 years after the cross. And so the 4 Gospels also were written within the time frame of the lives of Jesus' contemporaries, not generations later. Now, these comments disprove this popular claim that Jesus' death and resurrection were written generations later, and therefore not very credible.
Ken,
Yes.
can I make a comment, please?
Yes.
you all can hear me, it's just.
No, you'll need that. You'll need that for everyone to hear.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment, we have to remember, writing was an extremely difficult thing to happen back in the time of Christ and following that. So the traditional way that were stories that got passed down. So it really wouldn't be uncommon to have communities that had stories that they told over the years, every year, you know, for a long time. Every weekend was reviewed as the Easter Passion all over again. And so it was natural that there weren't many written things, but it was a very normal thing to pass stories. And so I think that's the medium that happened for so many years in between.
That is certainly a good point, the importance of oral history. Yes, absolutely. Now, I have this wonderful statement from William Barclay's volume on the Gospel of Mark. One thing is certain, if Jesus had not risen from the dead, we would never have heard of him, never have heard of him. The attitude of the disciples was that everything was finished in tragedy. And that's so true. If Jesus Christ had not risen, the apostles would have gone back to their lives and everything would have been over. But, my next point, the best proof of the resurrection is the existence of the Christian church. That's the best proof. Nothing else could have changed sad and despairing men and women into people radiant with joy and flaming with courage. The resurrection is the central fact of the whole Christian faith. What we're going to be celebrating this next week is the central fact of our entire faith. Adam Hamilton's comment is welcomed here. To me, the leap of faith required to believe in the resurrection of Christ is small. I am content to leave how it happened and the specific details of the resurrection and the death in the realm of mystery. But that he was raised, I feel content to trust as fact. Now, let me read to you from the book of Romans, which is, if I must say, my favorite epistle in the New Testament. Chapter 8, verse 11. I'm kind of changing the subject here from the resurrection of Jesus to our own. And if the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies because of his spirit who lives in you. Lee Strobel had a friend in Chicago who had lost his wife. Pretty good friend. And so Lee drove over to his house one day after the funeral, and they were just sitting out on the front porch talking, and Lee mostly was listening to his friend talk about his wife. And his friend just talked, and finally he made a statement, and he made it with utter conviction. If there is a resurrection, there is a heaven. Yeah, if there is a resurrection, then there is a heaven. If Jesus was raised, Debbie, his wife, Debbie was raised. And I will be someday too. Then I will see them both. Isn't that wonderful? And you know, I hope, I pray, that all of us will work on our faith about our going to heaven, that God has made that promise and that provision. I realize that it is something that most people have to work on to believe, this. But it's a cornerstone of our faith. It's a cornerstone of our faith. And I have a little note here. Why should it not be the centerpiece of our faith? So I want to challenge you. Let's work on that so that we will absolutely believe beyond doubt and with great joy and satisfaction that God has made provision for us to live eternally in the presence of God in Christ. Well, with the victory of Christ, all humankind was offered the opportunity to join forces with Him, to be set free from the power of evil and sin and death, and to live lives of hope, joy, freedom, and love. A wonderful quotation from Adam Hamilton, who says that during his many years of being a pastor, that he has shared many experiences with friends who sat in hospital rooms and heard the bad news and so on, and sat with them, all kinds of people having different kinds of medical experiences, and he looked and he listened and he loved. Looked and he listened and he loved, and he came to the conclusion. He came to the conclusion that yes, that there is life after death. There is life after death. I not only believe it, he said, but I'm counting on it. Counting. Aren't we all counting on it? That's part of our faith. Well, I think this pretty well concludes my three-part series, and I hope that as all of us go into Holy Week, following this wonderful service upstairs, that we will become closer to Christ and feel the presence of our Christian faith all the more. Let's see what we have here. We have here, I think, a couple of minutes. Do we have any comments or questions this morning? Ann?
If no one else will make a comment, I will. Is there someone else?
Joe?
Oh,
Well, I just wish to say that
Well, let's let Joe
I
say a
wish
few
God's
words.
richest blessings on you. I really needed that message this morning.
Thank you,
I
Joe.
need to know that. I believe it, and I'm living my faith as best I can and looking forward to being and recognizing Bill one of these days.
Yes. I have no doubt that you will see Bill.
Amen.
I absolutely believe that. And
Ken, I was going to say, of course, I have very strong feelings about that same hope in a very positive way. But I also feel the caution that we can't think that our faith is all about the next life, because it's all about right here, right now.
sure.
And that relationship that we have with God at this time and how we live our life now is critically important, not just to what happens in our future. You know, it always takes me back to Tim Brewster talking about his dad saying, all these people want to know what's going to happen if I die tonight. I want to know what's going to happen if I live tonight. And so, as much as we embrace the message of resurrection and that hope and that belief, our faith is to be lived out here through loving others and living the life that Jesus taught us.
Absolutely.
Amen.
Thank you.
Amen for that.
Well, okay, let's have a wonderful week this week. Bye.